Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the banks of the Nile, to a land of towering temples, golden deserts, and silent tombs that have survived for thousands of years. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in, perhaps dim the lights, and let the sounds of the modern world drift away. Tonight, we are stepping into ancient Egypt, a civilization famous for pyramids, pharaohs, and treasures beyond imagination. But beneath the grandeur existed something far more powerful than gold. Fear, not fear of invading armies, not fear of wild animals, not even fear of death itself, because ancient Egyptians believed death was only the beginning. What truly frightened them was something much worse, the possibility that after all their efforts, after every prayer, every offering, every carefully carved inscription, they might fail to reach eternity. Tonight we follow the life of one ordinary Egyptian man whose entire existence was shaped by that terrifying possibility. And through his eyes, we will discover what ancient Egyptians feared most. The story begins during the reign of a powerful pharaoh, when Egypt stood among the richest kingdoms on earth. The sun had not yet risen when a young boy named Menna opened his eyes. The air was cool, a rare comfort before another scorching day beside the Nile. His family's mud brick home stood among dozens of similar houses clustered near fertile farmland. Outside, darkness still covered the landscape, yet the village was already waking. Menna could hear movement, the distant braying of donkeys, the creaking of wooden carts, voices murmuring in preparation for another day. His father was already awake. Like most men in the village, he worked the fields that stretched alongside the river. The Nile controlled everything: food, wealth, survival. Every year, its floods brought life-giving silt across the land. Without the river, Egypt would become little more than endless desert. Menna stepped outside. The eastern horizon glowed faintly. Soon the sun god Ra would begin his daily journey across the sky. At least that was what everyone believed. To modern minds, sunrise feels predictable. For ancient Egyptians, it was something far more meaningful. Every dawn represented victory. Each morning, Ra defeated darkness once again. Each evening, he descended into the dangerous underworld. And every night, he faced terrible enemies before returning at sunrise. This belief shaped how Egyptians understood existence itself. Order was never guaranteed. Chaos waited constantly beyond the edges of the known world. The universe functioned only because divine forces maintained balance. The Egyptians called this balance mad. Truth, harmony, order, justice. Without mad, everything would collapse. Menna learned these ideas almost as soon as he learned to speak. Children heard them from parents. Farmers discussed them while working. Priests repeated them endlessly in temples. The concept existed everywhere. A person who respected Mad helped preserve cosmic stability. Someone who violated it threatened only themselves, but potentially the entire order of creation. For Menna, however, such concerns still felt distant. He was young. His thoughts focused more on daily life, fishing, playing with friends, helping his family, avoiding punishment. Yet even children could not completely escape Egypt's deeper fears, especially when death entered a household. A few weeks after his 10th birthday, death arrived unexpectedly. An elderly neighbor named Hori passed away. The old man had lived nearby for years. Menna often saw him sitting outside his home, telling stories about floods, harvests, and past rulers. Then one morning, he simply failed to wake. The news spread rapidly. Work paused. Conversations changed. People gathered. Death was familiar in ancient Egypt. Life expectancy remained short. Disease appeared frequently. Injuries could become deadly. Yet every death still mattered, because death initiated an extraordinarily important process. The villagers prepared Hori's body carefully. Family members mourned. Priests arrived. Prayers were spoken. Offerings were arranged. Menna watched much of it from a distance. Curiosity pulled him closer. Adults discussed matters he barely understood. The journey ahead, the weighing of the heart, the judgment, the dangers beyond death. The words sounded mysterious. At first, they felt almost like stories, but nobody treated them as fiction. Every person present believed these events would happen, not symbolically, literally. Hori's future depended upon them. Later that evening, Menna asked his father questions. The older man listened patiently. Then he explained. Death was not the end. The soul continued, but reaching eternal life required success. A person would eventually stand before divine judges. Their heart would be weighed against the feather of mat. If the heart remained pure, eternal existence awaited. If it failed, his father paused. The silence lasted several seconds. Menna noticed. Children always notice such things. What happens then? He asked. His father's face grew serious. The devourer waits. The answer sent a chill through the boy. The devourer. Even the name sounded frightening. His father described a monstrous creature, unlike anything found in nature. Part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, a nightmare assembled from Egypt's most dangerous animals. Its purpose was simple: to consume unworthy souls, not torture them, not imprison them, destroy them completely, forever. This possibility terrified Egyptians far more than physical death. To modern people, death often represents the ultimate ending. For ancient Egyptians, a second death was worse, infinitely worse. Physical death happened to everyone. Spiritual annihilation did not. A righteous person could avoid it, but the possibility remained, and nobody could know with certainty how judgment would unfold. That night, Menna struggled to sleep. Images filled his imagination. Dark halls, strange gods, scales measuring hearts, the monstrous devourer waiting nearby. For the first time, he began understanding why adults took religious rituals so seriously. The following weeks returned to normal. Fields needed tending. Animals required care. The river continued flowing north toward the sea. Life moved forward, yet something had changed inside Menna. Questions lingered. He watched temple ceremonies more carefully. He listened when elders discussed religious matters. Gradually, he discovered that fear of judgment influenced nearly every aspect of Egyptian life. People spoke honestly, not merely because honesty benefited society. Truth affected eternity. Kindness mattered. Respect mattered. Promises mattered. Even small actions carried spiritual consequences. A person's heart remembered everything. Years passed. Menna grew taller. His childhood slowly faded. Responsibilities increased. By adolescence, he spent long hours helping cultivate crops. The work proved exhausting. Egyptian agriculture demanded constant effort. Fields required irrigation. Canals needed maintenance. Harvests depended upon cooperation. Yet the rhythm of rural life also brought stability. Seasons followed predictable patterns. Floods arrived. Waters receded. Seeds were planted. Crops matured. Families survived. Still, beneath that stability remained uncertainty. The Nile occasionally failed. Disease spread without warning. Officials demanded taxes. Nature ignored human plans. Whenever hardships appeared, villagers often sought explanations through religion. Perhaps offerings had been neglected. Perhaps divine forces expressed displeasure. Perhaps balance had been disturbed. One summer brought particularly difficult conditions. Floodwaters arrived lower than expected. Fields produced less grain. Anxiety spread quickly. Food shortages threatened entire communities. Temple attendance increased. People prayed more intensely. Offerings became more frequent despite growing scarcity. Menna observed all of it. Fear influenced behavior, not merely fear of hunger, fear of cosmic disorder. If Mad weakened, consequences could reach far beyond a poor harvest. The Egyptians viewed earthly struggles and divine balance as deeply connected. As Menna entered adulthood, he married a young woman named Tia. Their lives followed familiar patterns. Work, family, community, religion. Children eventually arrived. The household expanded. Responsibilities multiplied. Years blended together. Yet one lesson remained constant. Every action contributed to a future reckoning. Every choice left a mark upon the heart. Sometimes Menna wondered whether anyone could truly remain pure enough for judgment. Even good people lost their tempers, made mistakes, spoke harsh words, acted selfishly. Human beings were imperfect. The scales of the afterlife, however, promised absolute fairness. Nothing could be hidden, nothing forgotten, nothing explained away. As middle age approached, another death shook the village. This time, the loss felt much closer. Menna's father became ill. At first, recovery seemed possible. Then weeks passed. Strength faded. Movement slowed. Eventually, the family understood the truth. The end was approaching. Menna spent long hours beside his father's bed. They talked quietly, sometimes about family, sometimes about memories, sometimes about matters beyond life itself. One evening, his father revealed something surprising. Despite decades of devotion, he still feared judgment, not because he considered himself evil, because certainty remained impossible. Had he always upheld Matt? Had he spoken every truth? Had every action reflected justice? The questions haunted him. Menna listened carefully. For years, he had imagined old age might bring confidence. Instead, he found doubt. Even a respected man approaching death, worried about what awaited beyond the grave. Several days later, his father passed away, and as preparations began, Menna felt those childhood fears returning. The prayers, the rituals, the preservation of the body. Every detail carried immense importance, because according to Egyptian belief, eternity depended upon them. As the funeral procession moved slowly toward the necropolis, Menna stared across the desert landscape beyond the fertile valley. Countless tombs stretched into the distance. Generations of Egyptians rested there. Farmers, officials, priests, artisans, nobles, each had lived beneath the same sun. Each had feared the same judgment, and each had hoped to overcome the greatest terror in Egyptian civilization. Not death, but oblivion, as the mourners continued walking beneath the burning afternoon sky. Menna found himself wondering a question that would follow him for years. What if the stories were true? And what if, despite all human effort, the journey through the afterlife proved even more dangerous than anyone imagined? The funeral procession continued moving across the edge of the desert, while the afternoon sun hung heavily above the horizon. Menna walked among the mourners in silence. Sand shifted beneath his sandals. Priests recited sacred words. Incense drifted through the dry air. Ahead stood the tomb, prepared for his father. Its appearance was modest compared to the elaborate burial chambers of nobles and officials. Yet, every detail had been arranged with care. For ordinary Egyptians, wealth varied greatly, but the desire for eternal life remained the same. Rich or poor, everyone hoped for a successful journey beyond death. As Menna approached the burial site, he noticed familiar objects being carried by relatives. Baskets of food, jars of beer, small household possessions, protective amulets, items intended to assist the deceased in the next world. To outsiders, such preparations might have seemed unnecessary. To Egyptians, they represented practical necessities. The afterlife was not imagined as a vague spiritual existence. It was another life, a continuation. The dead would need food, comfort, protection, guidance. Preparation mattered. Failure to prepare invited danger. That belief had shaped Egyptian culture for centuries. The ceremony lasted several hours. Priests performed rituals designed to restore the deceased's abilities in the next life. Special prayers were spoken, offerings were presented, ancient formulas were recited carefully. Words possessed power. A mistake could matter. A forgotten phrase could matter. Everything mattered. As the burial concluded, Menna experienced an unsettling realization. His father had spent an entire lifetime preparing for this moment. Years of work, years of worship, years of effort, and now the outcome rested beyond anyone's control. The thought followed him home. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Life resumed its familiar routines. Fields demanded attention. Children required guidance. Taxes needed payment. Yet Menna frequently found himself thinking about what happened after death. Not because he expected to die soon, because the older he became, the more real the future felt. When he was a boy, eternity seemed unimaginably distant. Now it felt closer. Time moved differently than it once had. Years passed more quickly. Seasons blurred together. Children became adults, almost without warning. One evening after harvest, Menna sat beside the Nile with several older villagers. The river reflected the fading colors of sunset. Conversation drifted from farming to religion. Such discussions often happened after long days of work. The oldest man present was a former temple worker named Painhasi. His hair had turned completely white decades earlier. His face carried deep lines carved by age and sunlight. Many villagers respected him because of his knowledge. When religious questions arose, people listened. That evening, someone asked a simple question. What frightens the dead most? The group fell quiet. Menna immediately became interested. Painhasi stared across the river for a long moment before answering. Being forgotten, several men nodded. Others remained silent. The answer surprised some of the younger listeners. Not judgment, not monsters, not demons. Forgotten. Painhasi continued speaking. In Egyptian belief, a person survived through several interconnected elements. The body, the soul, the name, the spirit. These aspects work together. Destroy one completely, and danger emerged. Destroy enough of them, and existence itself became threatened. This was why tombs contained inscriptions. This was why names were carved into stone. This was why families continued making offerings to deceased relatives. Memory preserved life. Forgetfulness invited destruction. The concept deeply disturbed Menna. Most people imagined death as a single event. The Egyptians saw something more complicated. Death was a process. a fragile transition requiring continued support. If descendants stopped remembering their ancestors, problems could arise. The dead depended upon the living. The living depended upon the dead. The relationship never truly ended. As years passed, Menna increasingly noticed signs of this fear throughout Egypt. Travelers shared stories about ancient rulers whose names had been deliberately erased. Monuments had been altered, images destroyed, inscriptions removed. Such acts represented more than political revenge. They were attacks against eternity itself. To erase someone's name was among the harshest punishments imaginable. A forgotten person risked disappearing forever. This fear lingered everywhere. On temple walls, inside tombs, within prayers, across generations, people desperately wanted remembrance, not fame, continuation, existence. One autumn, Menna traveled north with a trading caravan. The journey took him farther from home than he had ever gone. The Nile served as Egypt's great highway. Villages connected to towns, towns connected to cities. Every settlement depended upon the river. Along the way, Menna encountered sights unlike anything he had previously seen. Massive temples towered above surrounding buildings. Colossal statues guarded sacred entrances. Obelisks pierced the sky. Every surface seemed covered with inscriptions, stories, prayers, names, thousands upon thousands of names. At first, the carvings appeared decorative. Eventually, Menna understood their deeper purpose. The names were not merely records. They were acts of preservation. As long as a name survived, part of a person survived. Stone offered protection against oblivion. Many wealthy Egyptians invested enormous resources into securing remembrance. Some spent years preparing tombs. Others commissioned statues. Others filled burial chambers with texts intended to guide them safely through the afterlife. Fear motivated much of this effort. Not fear of physical death, fear of losing existence itself. During his travels, Menna visited a temple renowned for its library. Though not educated enough to read complex texts himself, he listened as priests discussed ancient writings. One story captured his attention immediately. It described the nightly journey of Ra through the underworld. Every evening, the sun god entered darkness. Every night, he faced terrifying dangers. Serpents, demons, chaos, enemies seeking to destroy creation. Every dawn represented victory. Order survived another night. The lesson was clear. Even gods faced threats. Existence required constant struggle. Nothing remained secure forever. If divine beings battled chaos endlessly, what hope did ordinary humans possess? The thought unsettled Menna. When he finally returned home, he brought new questions with him. His wife noticed the change. He spent more evenings contemplating, more time discussing religion, more time listening to priests. Aging often pushed people toward such concerns. The future gradually became more important than the past. Then tragedy struck once again. This time the victim was not elderly. Menna's younger brother died unexpectedly after a sudden illness. The speed shocked everyone. 1 week healthy, the next week gone. The loss hit Menna harder than he anticipated. His father had died after a long life. That death felt natural. His brother's death felt abrupt, unfinished, wronged. Watching the funeral, Menna observed something he had overlooked before. Fear, not among the deceased, among the living. Relatives worried constantly. Had every ritual been performed correctly? Had every prayer been spoken properly? Had the body been prepared adequately? Had sufficient offerings been provided? Questions never seemed to end. Anxiety accompanied grief. People wanted certainty. Religion offered hope, but certainty remained elusive. Months later, Menna found himself visiting his brother's tomb. The desert was quiet. Wind swept gently across the sand. The world felt distant. He placed offerings near the entrance and sat alone for some time. Eventually, his attention settled upon the carved name. His brother's name, visible, preserved, remembered. Suddenly, Painhassy's words returned. Being forgotten. For the first time, Menna truly understood. The fear extended beyond death itself. Everyone wanted assurance that future generations would remember them, would speak their names, would maintain their tombs, would continue the chain. Yet nobody could guarantee such things. Families disappeared. Floods damaged structures. Political turmoil altered societies. Time destroyed almost everything eventually. The realization lingered long after he returned home. Years continued passing. His children married. Grandchildren arrived. His hair began turning gray. His movements slowed. The certainty of youth faded. One winter evening, a traveling priest arrived in the village. Visitors often brought news from distant regions. Stories spread quickly through such encounters. After dinner, villagers gathered to hear him speak. The priest shared accounts from various temples across Egypt. Some stories involved miracles. Others involved warnings. One particular tale captured everyone's attention. It concerned tomb robbers. Ancient burial sites contained valuables. Gold, jewelry, fine objects. Temptation attracted criminals, despite severe punishments. According to the priest, several robbers had been caught after disturbing sacred tombs. The villagers reacted with outrage. Tomb robbery represented more than theft. It threatened the deceased, damaged burial chambers, destroyed inscriptions, disrupted eternity. For Egyptians, such crimes bordered on sacrilege. The priest described curses written inside certain tombs, warnings directed toward intruders, promises of divine punishment. Whether every curse proved real hardly mattered. People believed, and and belief carried power. That night, Menna considered another uncomfortable truth. Even after death, safety remained uncertain. A tomb could be damaged, a name erased, offerings neglected, memory lost. The path to eternity seemed far more fragile than he had once imagined. As old age approached, these concerns became increasingly personal. His own tomb required preparation. His own future demanded attention. Like countless Egyptians before him, Menna began making arrangements. Not extravagant arrangements, practical ones, instructions for family members, objects for burial, prayers for protection. Every decision reflected the same ancient desire: to survive, to endure, to continue. One afternoon, while supervising repairs near a canal, Menna encountered an elderly priest he had known for years. The priest appeared unusually thoughtful. Their conversation eventually turned toward death. Menna confessed something he rarely admitted aloud. The older he became, the more frightened he felt. Not of dying, of failing. The priest studied him carefully. Then he asked a question. What if the greatest fear is not judgment? Menna frowned. What could be worse? The priest's answer came quietly. What if a person reaches judgment and discovers they never truly understood themselves? The statement puzzled him at first, but the idea refused to leave, because according to Egyptian belief, the heart revealed everything: secrets, motives, choices, truth. No deception survived judgment. A person would stand exposed before eternity. Nothing hidden, nothing disguised, nothing forgotten. And as Menna walked home beneath the fatting sunlight, he began wondering whether the deepest fear in ancient Egypt was not merely death, annihilation, or being forgotten. Perhaps it was the terrifying possibility that one's own heart might become the final witness against them. The question followed Menna for many months, perhaps longer. The elderly priest had spoken only a single sentence, yet it continued echoing through his thoughts. Whenever he found himself alone, what if a person reached judgment and discovered they never truly understood themselves? At first, the idea seemed strange. Menna knew himself, didn't he? He knew his habits, his memories, his successes and failures, the choices he had made throughout life. Yet the more he considered the matter, the more uncertain he became. Ancient Egyptian religion taught that the heart was not merely an organ within the body. It was the center of thought, the seat of memory, the source of intention, the keeper of truth. While modern people often associate thinking with the brain, Egyptians viewed the heart very differently. The heart knew things. The heart remembered things. The heart could even betray its owner. This belief explained why preserving the heart during burial was considered so important. Other organs might be removed and stored separately during mummification. The heart usually remained because it would be needed later. needed when judgment arrived, needed when truth finally emerged. The thought was both comforting and frightening. Comforting because good deeds could never be lost. Frightening because neither could bad ones. As Menna grew older, he noticed something changing within himself. His attention increasingly shifted away from the future of the living and toward the future of the dead. Young men worried about harvests. Middle-aged men worried about families. Old men worried about eternity. This pattern seemed universal. The village elders spent long hours discussing matters younger generations often ignored. Tombs, prayers, offerings, ancestors, the afterlife, memory, names. These subjects returned repeatedly, not because the elders enjoyed dwelling on death, because death no longer felt distant. One evening Menna visited Painhasi, the elderly former temple worker whose wisdom remained respected throughout the region. Age had weakened him considerably. Walking now required assistance. His eyesight had faded. His voice lacked its former strength, yet his mind remained sharp. The old man welcomed Menna warmly. They sat together outside, while the Nile reflected the last colors of sunset. For a time, they discussed ordinary matters: children, weather, harvests. Then Menna finally raised the question troubling him. Did you ever fear judgment? Painhasi smiled faintly. The answer came without hesitation. Every year of my life. Menna found the response surprising. This was a man known for devotion, for wisdom, for understanding sacred traditions. If anyone should possess confidence, surely it was him. The old man seemed to understand his reaction. You imagine priests and temple servants fear less than others. Menna nodded. Painhasi chuckled softly. Knowledge can increase fear. The statement puzzled him. The old man continued. When children hear stories of the afterlife, they imagine simple things. Good people rewarded, bad people punished. But the more one learns, the more complex everything becomes. A breeze moved across the river. The reeds whispered gently in the fading light. Painhasi looked toward the western desert, the land of the dead. The afterlife contains many dangers, he said quietly. Most people focus on judgment because it is dramatic. Scales, gods, the weighing of the heart. But the journey before judgment also matters. Menna leaned forward. He had heard fragments of such stories before, never in detail. The old man described ancient texts used inside tombs, collections of spells, prayers, protective formulas, instructions intended to help the deceased navigate the underworld. The journey beyond death was not imagined as a peaceful walk toward paradise. It was an expedition through unfamiliar territory. The dead might encounter gates, guardians, serpents, rivers, divine beings, powerful entities demanding knowledge. Success required preparation. One needed the correct words, the correct names, the correct understanding. Hearing these descriptions, Menna felt a familiar unease. Even after decades of life, the afterlife remained full of uncertainties. The path toward eternity seemed crowded with obstacles. As darkness settled across the village, the conversation continued. Eventually, Menna returned home, carrying even more questions than before. Yet something else accompanied them, a growing realization. Fear had shaped ancient Egypt far more deeply than he had ever understood. Not panic, not terror, something quieter, a constant awareness of consequences, a belief that actions mattered, that existence possessed meaning beyond the present moment, that life formed only one chapter of a much larger story. The following spring brought unusual news. Government officials arrived from a larger town farther north. Their visit concerned taxes and records. Nothing extraordinary. Yet among them traveled a scribe, a highly educated man. Unlike most villagers, scribes could read and write fluently. Their skills granted access to knowledge unavailable to ordinary people. The village leader hosted the visitors. Several evenings of discussion followed. During one gathering, Menna found himself seated near the scribe. Their conversation eventually turned toward religion. The educated official spoke about texts preserved in temple libraries, stories copied for centuries, teachings passed from generation to generation. One subject particularly captured Menna's attention: the concept of the negative confession. According to tradition, individuals approaching judgment would proclaim numerous declarations before divine judges, not merely stating belief, declaring innocence regarding specific actions. The scribe recited examples from memory. I have not stolen. I have not murdered. I have not deceived. I have not caused unnecessary suffering. The list continued. Dozens of statements, each reflecting moral responsibilities expected throughout life. As Menna listened, he felt both admiration and discomfort. The standards were demanding, perhaps impossible. Could anyone honestly claim perfect innocence? The scribe seemed to anticipate the question. The goal is not perfection, he explained. The goal is harmony with Mad. That familiar word again. Mayat, order, balance, truth, justice, the foundation beneath Egyptian civilization. The principle connecting human behavior to cosmic stability. Menna had heard the concept since childhood. Now, nearing old age, he finally began appreciating its depth. The Egyptians feared chaos because chaos threatened existence itself. Everything they valued depended upon order surviving. Without Mayat, crops failed. Society weakened. The gods withdrew protection. The universe drifted toward destruction. Maintaining balance became both a social duty and a spiritual necessity. The conversation remained with him long after the officials departed. Weeks later, another event reinforced these thoughts. A severe sandstorm swept across the region. Such storms were not unknown, yet this one proved unusually powerful. For hours, visibility disappeared. Wind howled relentlessly. Fine sand invaded homes. Fields suffered damage. Travel became impossible. Families remained indoors, waiting for the storm to pass. When calm finally returned, villagers emerged to inspect the consequences. Several structures required repairs. Canals needed clearing. Work multiplied. Standing outside afterward, Menna stared toward the desert. The storm had transformed portions of the landscape. Familiar features seemed altered. Paths vanished. Markers disappeared. The scene reminded him how fragile human efforts could be. Generations built monuments. Nature erased them. Families preserved memories. Time weakened them. Individuals pursued eternity. Yet uncertainty remained. Perhaps this explained why Egyptians devoted so much energy toward preservation. They understood impermanence. They lived beside it daily. Years passed. More friends died. More funerals occurred. Names gradually shifted from the living community to the community of ancestors. Menna attended so many burials that individual ceremonies sometimes blended together. Yet certain details never lost their impact. The prayers, the offerings, the hope, the fear. Every funeral represented another person beginning the journey. Everyone discussed, but nobody truly understood. One particularly emotional burial involved a childhood friend named Hai. The two men had grown up together, worked together, shared decades of experiences. Watching Hai's funeral felt strangely different from previous losses. For the first time, Menna recognized himself among the remaining mourners. The younger generation now stood behind him. The elderly group had become smaller. Many faces from his youth were gone. An uncomfortable truth emerged. His turn approached. Not immediately, but inevitably. The realization arrived quietly, without drama, without panic, simply certainty. That evening, he sat alone outside his home. Stars appeared one by one above the darkening landscape. The Nile reflected fragments of moonlight. The world seemed peaceful. Yet beneath the calm surface, Menna felt something shifting. For most of life, he had viewed death as an event awaiting the distant future. Now he began viewing it as a destination, gradually approaching, a place visible on the horizon, still far enough away, no longer invisible. During the following months, he spent increasing time with his grandchildren. Their energy amused him. Their curiosity reminded him of himself decades earlier. Often they asked questions about religion, about gods, about tombs, about the afterlife. Children remained fascinated by such subjects. One evening, a grandson asked a question that startled him. "Grandfather, what are you most afraid of?" The answer should have been simple, yet it wasn't. Not anymore. As a young man, he might have answered differently. Hunger, disease, failure, loss. Now the question felt deeper. He considered it carefully. Finally, he replied, I fear leaving things unfinished. The child seemed satisfied, but Menna continued, reflecting long afterward. Leaving things unfinished. Perhaps that truly lay at the heart of Egyptian fears. Not merely death, interruption, an existence cut short before achieving balance, before making peace with mistakes, before securing remembrance, before preparing properly for eternity. As old age advanced, these concerns became increasingly important. His body weakened gradually. Nothing dramatic, just small changes, slower movement, less strength, more fatigue, the ordinary signs of passing years, the signs everyone recognized, the signs nobody could prevent. One afternoon, he visited the village temple. The building was modest compared to the great temples of major cities, yet it remained sacred. The familiar scent of incense filled the air. Priests moved quietly through shadowed corridors. Offerings rested before statues of the gods. Menna spent several hours there in contemplation. At one point, he found himself staring at a carved image depicting the weighing of the heart. The scene appeared countless times throughout Egypt. Anubis beside the scales, the heart on one side, the feather of Mad on the other. Nearby waited the terrifying devourer, patient, silent, watching. Menna had seen such images since childhood, yet something about this moment felt different, perhaps because he no longer viewed the scene as a distant religious symbol. He viewed it as a future appointment. One day, according to everything he believed, he would stand there. One day, the scales would determine his fate. One day, truth would outweigh reputation. Intentions would outweigh appearances. Reality would outweigh stories. As he left the temple near sunset, a strange mixture of fear and acceptance settled over him. The path ahead remained uncertain, but uncertainty itself had always been part of life. No Egyptian could completely eliminate it. Not pharaohs, not priests, not farmers, not scribes. Everyone walked toward the same mystery. And as Menna slowly made his way home beneath the fading glow of evening, he could not know that a discovery waiting in the years ahead would force him to confront the deepest and oldest fear in ancient Egypt. A fear hidden not within tombs, not within monsters, but within the fragile human desire to live forever. The years moved onward with quiet determination. Menna no longer measured time by seasons alone. He measured it by absences. The empty seat where a friend once sat, the familiar voice no longer heard in the marketplace, the neighbor whose doorway remained closed, the names spoken less frequently with each passing year. Old age had a strange way of changing how a person saw the world. When young, life seemed full of arrivals. new experiences, new friendships, new opportunities. Later, life became a series of farewells, not dramatic farewells, small ones, steady ones, the kind that accumulated gradually until a person realized they now carried more memories than expectations. One particularly hot summer afternoon, Menna found himself walking along a section of riverbank he had not visited in years. The Nile flowed calmly beside him. Farmers worked nearby. Children played in shallow water. Birds searched for fish among the reeds. At first glance, little seemed different from his childhood. Yet everything had changed. The children were different children. The farmers belonged to a new generation. The elders, who once supervised the fields, were mostly gone. Even the landscape had shifted slightly. Canals had been altered. Fields expanded. Structures rebuilt. The world never stopped moving. The realization stirred an uncomfortable thought. If everything changed constantly, how could anyone truly preserve themselves forever? The question lingered as he continued walking. Later that evening, he visited the tomb of his father. Years had passed since the burial. Wind and sand had left subtle marks upon the structure. Nothing severe, nothing alarming, yet the passage of time remained visible. Menna carefully cleaned several areas. He refreshed offerings. He spoke prayers, and as tradition encouraged, he spoke his father's name aloud. The sound seemed strangely powerful. Simple words carried extraordinary meaning in Egyptian belief. A spoken name renewed existence. A remembered person remained connected to the world. Silence, however, was dangerous. Silence could become forgetting, and forgetting represented one of the greatest threats imaginable. As he prepared to leave, Menna noticed another nearby tomb in poor condition. Part of its outer wall had collapsed. Several inscriptions were damaged. No visitors appeared. No fresh offerings remained. The place looked abandoned. He stood quietly for several moments. Who rested there? Who once loved them? Who once spoke their name? No answers came. Only wind. For the first time, Menna experienced something colder than fear of judgment. He experienced fear of disappearance. Not punishment, not destruction by monsters. Simple erasure. The possibility that one day nobody would remember. Nobody would visit. Nobody would speak his name. The thought followed him home. Days later, he discussed the matter with one of the temple priests. The priest listened carefully before responding. Many people misunderstand eternity, he said. Menna frowned. How so? The priest gestured toward the village surrounding them. Hundreds of people lived here before us. Hundreds more will come after us. Most names vanish eventually. The answer did not comfort him. If anything, it deepened his concern. The priest seemed to notice. Yet disappearance from memory and disappearance from existence are not necessarily the same thing. The statement intrigued Menna. The The priest explained that religious beliefs varied even among educated Egyptians. Some traditions emphasized remembrance by descendants. Others placed greater emphasis upon divine recognition. The gods remembered what humans forgot. Human memory was fragile. Divine memory endured. Menna wanted to find reassurance in those words. Yet uncertainty remained. Ancient Egyptians lived with uncertainty constantly. They built tombs because they feared forgetting. They offered prayers because they feared judgment. They honored the gods because they feared chaos. Fear and hope existed side by side. Neither ever fully defeated the other. Several months later, an unusual traveler arrived in the village. The man claimed to have spent years working near royal construction projects farther south. Naturally, villagers gathered to hear his stories. Such visitors provided rare glimpses into distant parts of Egypt. The traveler described magnificent temples, enormous statues, sacred festivals, processions involving thousands of participants. Most fascinating of all were his stories about royal tombs. According to the traveler, some pharaohs devoted vast portions of their lives to preparing for death. Entire teams of craftsmen worked for years, decorating burial chambers. Artists painted walls with extraordinary detail. Scribes copied sacred texts. Priests conducted rituals. Architects designed hidden passages. Every effort served a single purpose: protection. Even rulers who commanded armies and controlled immense wealth ultimately feared the same things as ordinary farmers: death, judgment, oblivion. The traveler paused dramatically before sharing another observation. Many tomb builders never revealed what they created. Some construction sites remained secret, hidden, protected, because everyone understood a troubling reality. No matter how magnificent a tomb became, thieves might eventually find it. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Tomb robbery remained one of the most disturbing crimes imaginable, not only because valuables could be stolen, because the dead themselves could be harmed, their preparations disrupted, their journey endangered. Menna listened carefully. The conversation reinforced something he had gradually learned over the years. Nothing on earth remained completely secure. Not wealth, not monuments, not power, not memory. Even kings struggled against the passage of time, and time usually won. The following winter brought unusually cold nights. Nothing severe by modern standards, yet cold enough that families gathered closely indoors after sunset. These evenings often became opportunities for storytelling. One night, Menna's grandchildren begged him to share tales from his youth. At first, he told simple stories: fishing adventures, harvest celebrations, village festivals. Then one granddaughter asked a surprising question: "Were you ever brave?" The family laughed gently. Menna smiled. Yet the question remained. Had he been brave? He considered the matter. Images from decades of life passed through his thoughts. Hard work, loss, responsibility, mistakes, grief, love, perseverance. Finally, he answered, most bravery isn't what people imagine. The children listened attentively. Real bravery is continuing despite fear. The room grew quieter, perhaps because the statement felt true, perhaps because everyone recognized something familiar within it. Ancient Egyptians often appeared confident in their beliefs. They built temples, performed rituals, prepared tombs, yet underneath those actions existed uncertainty. Faith did not eliminate fear. It helped people live with it. As years accumulated, Menna increasingly appreciated this distinction. The purpose of religion was not necessarily to remove every doubt. The purpose was to provide direction despite doubt, a path through uncertainty, a way forward. One spring morning, news arrived from a neighboring settlement. A flood had damaged several burial sites near the river. Though no lives were lost, the incident caused widespread concern. Villagers discussed it for weeks. Some worried about the affected dead. Others worried about their own family tombs. Nature possessed immense power. Even carefully constructed monuments could suffer damage. Menna visited his father's tomb again soon afterward, not because repairs were needed, because reassurance was needed. Standing before the familiar structure, he felt a mixture of emotions difficult to describe. Sadness, love, responsibility, and beneath everything else, fear. Not the sharp fear of immediate danger, the quieter fear that accompanied age, the fear of running out of time. The realization surprised him. For years, he had focused on the afterlife. Now another concern emerged. Preparation. Had he prepared enough? Had he passed along important knowledge? Had he fulfilled obligations to family? Had he achieved balance? Questions multiplied without providing answers. That evening, he sat beside the Nile, watching the sunset. The sky burned with deep shades of gold and red. The river reflected the colors beautifully. Moments like these had always brought comfort, yet they also encouraged reflection. As darkness approached, Menna remembered a conversation from many years earlier, his father speaking softly beside a sickbed, admitting uncertainty despite a lifetime of devotion. At the time, Menna had struggled to understand. Now he understood completely. The closer one came to judgment, the less certain everything seemed. Not because faith weakened, because the stakes became real. A young man can discuss eternity casually. An old man cannot. For an old man, eternity is no longer theory. It is approaching reality. The following year marked another turning point. Painhasi, the wise former temple worker, finally passed away. The old man had survived longer than almost anyone expected, yet even he could not escape time forever. His funeral attracted people from several nearby villages. Many came simply to pay respects. Others came because they had learned from him. Menna attended with heavy emotions. Throughout his life, Painhasi had often provided guidance during difficult moments. Now another familiar voice had fallen silent. After the ceremony, Menna spent time speaking with those who had known the old man. Several stories emerged repeatedly. His wisdom, his patience, his devotion, his kindness. As Menna listened, an important realization slowly formed. Painhasi would be remembered, not because of wealth, not because of power, because of how he treated others. The thought lingered. Perhaps legacy involved more than names carved into stone. Perhaps memory survived through actions, through influence, through lives touched along the way. The idea offered unexpected comfort, yet comfort never fully erased fear. Fear remained part of the human experience, especially in ancient Egypt, especially among those contemplating eternity. Months later, while organizing household possessions, Menna discovered several old objects from his youth. Simple items, tools, personal belongings, small reminders of earlier years. Holding them awakened memories he had not considered in decades. Faces returned, voices returned, moments returned. The experience felt strangely powerful. Memory could resurrect the past, if only briefly. And suddenly, a troubling question emerged. What memories would survive after he was gone? Which stories would continue? Which lessons would endure? Which moments would vanish forever? The answers remained hidden. Like so much else, as another year drew toward its end, Menna increasingly sensed that he stood near the final chapter of life, not at the very end, but close enough to see its outline, close enough to feel its presence, and somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon of ordinary existence, waited the mystery every Egyptian eventually faced, the weighing of the heart, the judgment of truth, the fate of the soul. But before Menna could confront those ultimate questions, a startling discovery buried beneath desert sands would force him to reconsider everything he believed about fear, memory, and what it truly meant to live forever. The discovery came during the season when the Nile had begun retreating from its annual flood. Fields slowly emerged from beneath the waters. Farmers returned to work. Villages resumed their familiar rhythm. Life, as always, moved forward. Yet a few days' journey south of Menna's village, something unusual had happened. Workers digging near an old necropolis had uncovered a sealed burial chamber. News traveled quickly, especially when ancient tombs were involved. Within weeks, travelers carried the story from village to village. Each retelling added new details. Some claimed the tomb belonged to a forgotten noble. Others insisted it contained a priest. A few even whispered that the burial might date back centuries before the current dynasty. Nobody seemed entirely certain. That uncertainty only made the story more fascinating. When the news finally reached Menna, he listened with interest but little expectation. Egypt contained countless tombs. New discoveries were not unheard of. Most produced temporary excitement before fading from conversation. Yet this discovery proved different, because among the objects found inside the chamber was something unusual, a collection of remarkably preserved writings, texts that appeared far older than many priests had ever seen. Soon scholars, scribes, and temple officials began examining them, and as fragments of their contents spread outward through Egypt, they sparked discussion everywhere. Several months later, a temple scribe traveling through Menna's village shared what he had learned. The gathering took place after sunset. Villagers crowded around oil lamps while the visitor spoke. At first, he described the tomb itself, its age, its condition, its inscriptions. Then he began discussing the writings. According to the scribe, many of the texts focused on a surprisingly specific subject: fear, not physical fear, spiritual fear, the fears that haunted people when they thought about death and eternity. Menna immediately paid closer attention. The visitor explained that even in ancient times, centuries before Menna's birth, Egyptians worried about many of the same questions. Would they be remembered? Would they pass judgment? Would their souls survive? Would their names endure? The concerns sounded familiar, almost timeless. Then the scribe mentioned something that captured everyone's imagination. One text described a man standing before the gods after death. Not a wicked man, not a criminal, simply an ordinary individual. The man feared judgment, yet when questioned by divine beings, he revealed a deeper anxiety. He feared that his life had lacked meaning. The villagers exchanged thoughtful glances. The idea felt unexpectedly personal. Most religious stories focused on rules, punishments, rewards. This one focused on purpose. Had a life been worthwhile? Had it mattered? The question lingered long after the gathering ended. For Menna, it remained especially powerful because old age naturally encouraged such reflections. When young, people often ask what they will become. When old, they ask what they have become. The difference is significant. Several days later, Menna found himself walking beside the Nile once again. The river had accompanied every stage of his life: childhood, marriage, fatherhood, old age. Its waters flowed endlessly, while generations came and went. As he watched the current move northward, memories surfaced. Thousands of them, some joyful, others painful, some vivid, others fading. He remembered his father's voice, his mother's laughter, friends long buried beneath desert sands, faces he had not consciously recalled for years. The experience felt almost overwhelming. A strange realization emerged. The dead lived inside memory, not physically, not permanently, but in fragments, stories, habits, lessons, moments. As long as those fragments survived, part of them survived too. Perhaps that explained why Egyptians fought so hard against forgetting, not merely because religion demanded it, because forgetting felt like a second death. One evening shortly afterward, Menna's eldest grandson approached him with a request. The young man wanted to learn family history. At first, the conversation seemed ordinary. Then Menna noticed something surprising. The grandson knew very little about relatives who had died before his birth. Names had already begun fading. Details had already been lost. Entire lives reduced to brief references. The realization disturbed him. His father had once seemed larger than life. Now younger generations barely knew anything about him. How long before the same happened to Menna? 2 generations. 3, 4. The process had already begun, and it would continue. That night he slept poorly. Questions filled his thoughts. What remained of a person after memory faded? Did the gods truly preserve what humanity forgot? Were tombs enough? Were prayers enough? Could anything truly withstand time forever? The next morning, before sunrise, he left home and walked toward the desert. The eastern horizon slowly brightened. Cool air drifted across the landscape. In the distance stood countless tombs, some new, some ancient, some maintained carefully, others nearly consumed by sand. The sight affected him differently than it once had. As a boy, tombs had seemed mysterious. As a young man, they had seemed distant. As an old man, they appeared familiar, almost like neighbors. Generations rested there. People who had worried about the same things. People who had loved, struggled, hoped, and feared. People who had believed their own lives important. Just as he did, the realization created an unexpected sense of connection. Across centuries, human concerns changed less than people imagined. Different rulers, different events, different circumstances. Yet beneath everything remained the same questions. What gives life meaning? What survives death? How should one live? What awaits beyond? No generation fully answered them. Every generation continued asking. A few weeks later, another traveler arrived carrying stories from a major temple complex. Among the tales was one that fascinated Menna. The traveler described an elderly priest nearing death. According to the story, followers had asked the priest whether he feared the afterlife. His response surprised everyone. I fear wasted years more than death. The statement spread quickly. Many repeated it. Some admired it. Others debated it. Menna found himself thinking about it constantly. Wasted years. The phrase felt uncomfortably powerful. Ancient Egyptians feared judgment because judgment revealed truth, not reputation, not status. Truth. A wealthy man could not purchase innocence. A powerful official could not command the scales. A respected elder could not hide mistakes. The heart remembered reality. Perhaps that was what made judgment so frightening. Absolute honesty. No excuses. No disguises. No illusions. The heart would reveal exactly who a person had been, and that realization forced Menna to examine his own life more carefully than ever before. He thought about moments of kindness, moments of selfishness, moments of courage, moments of weakness. No life consisted entirely of one or the other. Every person carried contradictions. Every person contained light and shadow. The challenge was finding balance, finding Mad. As another year passed, Menna began spending more time teaching his grandchildren. Not formal lessons, life lessons, stories, advice, memories. He taught them practical skills, how to observe weather patterns, how to care for crops, how to navigate river currents. But he also taught deeper things: the importance of honesty, responsibility, compassion, patience. At first, he did so because he enjoyed their company. Gradually, he realized another reason. Teaching preserved memory, knowledge passed from one generation to another. Influence continued. Perhaps this, too, represented a form of immortality, not the immortality promised by tombs, a different kind, one rooted in people rather than stone. One afternoon, while watching his grandchildren work together, he remembered Painhasi. The old temple worker had died, yet his lessons remained. His words remained. His influence remained. Perhaps he was not truly gone. Not entirely. The thought brought comfort, more comfort than many religious debates. Months later, Menna visited a temple festival in a nearby town. The event attracted large crowds. Music filled the streets. Priests carried sacred images through decorated avenues. Merchants sold food and goods. Children laughed. Families celebrated. The atmosphere felt joyful. Yet amid the festivities, Menna noticed something interesting. Many ceremonies focused not on death, but on life. Gratitude, renewal, continuity. Ancient Egypt often appears obsessed with death to outsiders. Yet Egyptians invested tremendous energy into living well, perhaps because they believed life prepared them for eternity. One could not separate the two. The afterlife reflected earthly existence. Preparation began long before death arrived. That evening, while returning home beneath a sky crowded with stars, Menna experienced a subtle shift in perspective. For years, he had concentrated on fears: judgment, oblivion, forgetting, punishment. Now another possibility emerged. Perhaps fear alone had never been the central lesson. Perhaps the purpose of those fears was guidance. Fear encouraged preparation. Preparation encouraged reflection. Reflection encouraged wisdom. And wisdom encouraged a better life. The realization: did not eliminate uncertainty. Nothing could, but it changed how he viewed it. Uncertainty no longer seemed purely threatening. It also provided purpose, motivation, direction. Still, one mystery remained unresolved. Among all the fears that shaped ancient Egypt, which truly stood above the rest, the devourer, judgment, chaos, being forgotten, the question remained unanswered. Yet fate was already moving quietly toward its conclusion, because in the years ahead, as Menna's final chapter approached, he would encounter an experience so profound that it would reveal what ancient Egyptians feared most, not through stories, not through priests, but through the final journey every soul was destined to face. The years that followed passed more quietly than any period Menna could remember. Not because nothing happened. Life always happened. Children were born. Neighbors died. Harvests succeeded or failed. The Nile rose and fell. The sun crossed the sky. The stars returned each night. Yet for Menna, the world seemed to move with a different rhythm now. The urgency of youth had disappeared. The ambitions of middle age had faded. What remained was observation, reflection, awareness. He noticed things he once overlooked. The way older people watched younger generations. The way memories surfaced unexpectedly. The way time altered everything while pretending to stand still. One morning, he woke before dawn and stepped outside. The village remained asleep. Only a few lamps glowed faintly through doorways. Above him, countless stars filled the darkness. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening. The silence felt ancient, almost sacred. Then a thought entered his mind. Every person who had ever lived beneath those stars had eventually vanished. Pharaohs, farmers, priests, soldiers, children, merchants, all gone. Their worries had felt important. Their struggles had felt enormous. Yet time had swallowed nearly all of them. The realization was not depressing. It was humbling. Ancient Egyptians understood this better than most civilizations. That was why they fought so fiercely against oblivion, not because they believed themselves immortal, because they knew they were not. As dawn approached, Menna watched the eastern horizon brighten. The arrival of sunlight never seemed ordinary to Egyptians. Each sunrise represented renewal, victory, continuity, another day granted by the gods. When he was young, he accepted this belief without much thought. Now he found genuine comfort in it. Every dawn suggested that endings were not always final, that cycles continued, that life possessed rhythms larger than individual existence. Later that same week, Menna traveled to a neighboring settlement to visit a distant relative. The journey was short, only a few hours along the river. Yet the visit produced an unexpected conversation. The relative, an elderly woman named Hinat, had recently survived a serious illness. Many believed she would not recover. Yet somehow she had endured. Naturally, people asked whether the experience changed her perspective. Hinut's answer surprised everyone. I feared leaving more than dying. Several listeners appeared confused. She explained, death itself did not frighten her greatly. The separation did. Leaving family, leaving familiar places, leaving unfinished conversations, leaving the world she understood. The statement resonated deeply with Menna. For decades, he had focused on what came after death. Perhaps he had overlooked something important. The transition itself, the act of letting go. Ancient Egyptians prepared extensively for eternity, yet preparation did not necessarily make departure easy. The living world remained precious, even for those who believed another existence awaited. As he returned home, Menna reflected on this idea. Perhaps one reason Egyptians invested so much effort into preserving the dead was because they loved life so much. The afterlife was often imagined as a continuation of earthly joys. Fields, family, food, celebration, order. The ideal future resembled the ideal present. That connection suddenly seemed obvious. The goal was never escape from life. The goal was continuation. Several months later, an event occurred that stirred the entire village. A respected local official died unexpectedly. Unlike most villagers, the man possessed considerable wealth. His funeral preparations became unusually elaborate. Professional mourners participated. Priests traveled from distant locations. Large quantities of offerings were presented. The ceremony lasted much longer than ordinary burials. Crowds gathered to watch. Among the attendees, conversations frequently returned to a familiar topic. Would wealth help in the afterlife? The question had existed for generations. Some believed elaborate preparations improved one's chances. Others argued that moral character mattered more. Menna listened carefully. The debate revealed something fascinating. Despite centuries of religious tradition, uncertainty remained. No one possessed absolute knowledge. Everyone hoped, everyone believed, yet nobody could confirm exactly what awaited beyond death. Faith filled the gap left by uncertainty, but uncertainty never disappeared entirely. That evening, Menna found himself thinking about the wealthy official. The man had owned more possessions than most villagers could imagine, yet death had treated him exactly the same as everyone else. His status ended at the tomb entrance. His titles ended at the tomb entrance. His wealth ended at the tomb entrance. Only his heart continued forward. That idea struck Menna with unusual force. Only the heart continued. Everything else remained behind. Years earlier, that realization would have frightened him. Now it felt strangely liberating. A person's true value could not be measured by possessions, only by the life they had lived. As time continued passing, Menna's health gradually declined. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, simply the steady changes that accompany advanced age. His back ached more frequently. Long walks became difficult. Fatigue arrived sooner. Some days required more rest than work. The village healer offered remedies. Family members offered assistance. Yet everyone understood the truth. Age could be delayed. It could not be defeated. Oddly enough, Menna found himself becoming calmer, not less aware of death, more accepting of it. The fear that had haunted him during middle age began changing shape. It no longer felt like a dark shadow lurking nearby. Instead, it resembled a distant shoreline, slowly coming into view. Still mysterious, still uncertain, but no longer unimaginable. One evening, while sitting beside the Nile with his eldest grandson, Menna experienced a conversation he would remember for the rest of his life. The young man had become an adult now, strong, thoughtful, capable. They watched the river flow silently for several minutes. Then the grandson asked a question. "Grandfather, what do you think happens after death?" Menna smiled. The question felt familiar. He had asked similar things as a child. For a long moment, he considered his answer. Finally, he spoke. "I think everyone spends their life preparing to find out." The grandson laughed softly, yet Menna remained serious. It was the most honest answer he could offer. No living person truly knew. Beliefs existed. Traditions existed. Sacred texts existed. But certainty belonged to the dead. The living could only prepare. The conversation continued until sunset. When they finally rose to leave, Menna felt unexpectedly grateful, not because he possessed answers, because he had learned to live without them. That lesson might have been more valuable. The following year brought another significant moment. A group of travelers arrived carrying copies of religious teachings from distant temples. Among them was a story unfamiliar to most villagers. The tale described a man who spent his entire life terrified of judgment. He performed every ritual correctly, followed every instruction, obsessed over every possible mistake. Yet, according to the story, he ultimately missed an important truth. Fear alone could not create virtue. Fear could encourage good behavior, but genuine goodness required something deeper. Compassion, wisdom, understanding, balance. The story sparked lengthy discussions. Many villagers debated its meaning. Menna listened quietly because the lesson felt strangely relevant. For much of his life, fear had occupied a central place in his understanding of religion. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of oblivion. Yet perhaps those fears were never intended as destinations. Perhaps they were signposts, warnings designed to guide people toward something better, toward mayat, toward harmony, toward a meaningful life. The realization lingered, and as it did, another thought gradually emerged. Maybe the greatest Egyptian fear was not punishment. Maybe it was living incorrectly, living in a way that left the heart unbalanced, living in a way that damaged harmony, living in a way that wasted the opportunity life provided. The idea seemed increasingly plausible. Years passed. Menna entered an age few people reached. Many contemporaries had already died. Even some younger acquaintances were gone. The village itself felt different. New families occupied old homes. New children played in familiar streets. The world continued renewing itself. One cool evening, shortly after harvest season, Menna sat outside watching his family gather for a meal. Children laughed. Adults exchanged stories. Firelight flickered across smiling faces. The scene filled him with profound contentment, and suddenly he understood something important. If death arrived tomorrow, he would still wish for more time, not because life had failed him, because life had been valuable. There was a difference, a significant difference. The desire for more time did not necessarily reflect fear. Sometimes it reflected gratitude. That realization transformed something inside him. For decades, he had viewed death primarily as a threat. Now he began viewing it as part of a larger journey. Not welcome, not desired, but natural, like sunset following daylight, like harvest following planting, like winter following summer. Every cycle possessed an ending. Without endings, cycles could not exist. As another year faded into memory, Menna sensed the final stage approaching more clearly than ever before. His body confirmed it. His energy confirmed it. The passage of time confirmed it. And yet, rather than feeling overwhelmed, he felt curious. Curious about the mystery he had contemplated his entire life. Curious about the truths hidden beyond the horizon. Curious about whether the stories were real, whether judgment awaited, whether eternity existed, whether the heart truly remembered everything. The answers remained concealed. For now, but not for much longer, because before many more seasons passed, Menna would experience the event every ancient Egyptian spent a lifetime preparing for. And in that moment, he would finally discover the terrifying truth hidden beneath all the fears of his civilization. The fear that had shaped temples, tombs, prayers, and dreams for thousands of years. Menna spent several minutes simply looking at it. So many years had passed since the funeral, yet certain memories remained vivid. His father's voice, his final advice, his uncertainty, the fear he had confessed near the end. Back then, Menna had struggled to understand. Now he understood completely. No amount of faith entirely erased uncertainty. The unknown remained unknown. That was part of what made it sacred. Eventually, Menna approached the tomb entrance. He spoke his father's name aloud, then his mother's, then several friends who had died over the years. The names felt powerful, not magical, meaningful. Each one represented an entire life, an entire world of experiences. Love, failure, joy, regret, hope, fear, all contained within a few spoken sounds. As he prepared to leave, a curious thought entered his mind. One day, someone would stand beside his tomb and speak his name. Perhaps a son, perhaps a grandson, perhaps someone not yet born. The image felt strangely comforting, not because it guaranteed immortality, because it represented connection, the chain continuing, life moving forward. Back in the village, Menna's strength continued fading. The process remained gradual, yet unmistakable. Days of activity became shorter. Rest periods became longer. Simple movements demanded greater effort. Despite this, his mind remained clear, perhaps clearer than ever. The distractions that once occupied daily life seemed less important now. Taxes, arguments, minor frustrations, all the things that once felt enormous had shrunk considerably. What remained were essentials: family, memory, meaning, the heart. One night, unable to sleep, Menna stepped outside alone. Moonlight covered the village. Most people were already asleep. Only distant sounds disturbed the silence. He looked toward the western desert, the land where Egyptians buried their dead, the land associated with sunset, the land associated with endings. For years, he had imagined what awaited beyond that symbolic horizon. The judgment, the scales, the feather of Maat, the devourer, the divine court. Now those images returned more vividly than ever. Yet something about them had changed. They no longer felt like frightening stories told to children. They felt like questions, questions awaiting answers. Would the heart truly be weighed? Would every action be remembered? Would the gods be waiting? Would eternity prove real? No living person knew. Soon, however, Menna would. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, it awakened curiosity. Not complete calm, not complete confidence. Curiosity, a desire to understand the mystery that had shaped his entire civilization. The next morning, a priest visited his home. The two men had known each other for years. Their conversation lasted much of the afternoon. They discussed religion, memory, death, the future. At one point, Menna asked a question. After all your years serving the gods, what do you think people fear most? The priest remained silent for several moments. Then he answered carefully. They fear that their lives mattered less than they hoped. The words struck Menna immediately, because they felt true. Judgment mattered. Oblivion mattered. Being forgotten mattered. Yet beneath all those fears lay a deeper concern. Meaning, people wanted their lives to matter, wanted their choices to matter, wanted their existence to matter. If life possessed meaning, then death became easier to face. If life lacked meaning, then even eternity might feel empty. The priest continued speaking. Most people focus on what happens after death, but the heart is shaped before death. Menna nodded slowly. The statement aligned perfectly with everything he had learned over the years. Judgment was not merely an event awaiting the future. It reflected the life already lived. The scales revealed truth. They did not create it. After the priest departed, Menna spent the remainder of the day thinking. Memory after memory surfaced. Moments of kindness, moments of selfishness, successes, mistakes, acts of courage, acts of weakness. The collection formed a complete life. Not a perfect life, a human life. Perhaps that was enough. Weeks passed. The village entered another season. Fields changed color. Harvest preparations began. Children who once seemed tiny now appeared nearly grown. Time continued its relentless movement. One afternoon, Menna watched workers carrying grain across the village. The sight reminded him of his youth. Decades earlier, he had performed the same labor. At the time, old age seemed unimaginably distant. Now youth felt distant instead. The reversal amused him. Life possessed a strange symmetry. Young people imagine endless tomorrows. Old people understand the value of today. Neither perspective is entirely wrong, yet they are profoundly different. As autumn approached, Menna's family began spending evenings together more frequently. Stories flowed easily. Laughter remained common. Sometimes tears appeared as well, not because anyone wished to be sad, because everyone recognized the preciousness of limited time. A conversation could become a memory unexpectedly. An ordinary evening could become the last ordinary evening. Such awareness changed how people listened, changed how they loved, changed how they valued one another. One night, after the others had gone to sleep, Menna remained awake beside a small oil lamp. The flame flickered gently. Shadows moved across the walls. For reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself remembering Hari, the elderly neighbor whose death had frightened him as a child. The first funeral he had truly observed. The first time he heard about judgment. The first time he learned about the devourer. Decades had passed since then, a lifetime, and now he stood where Hari once stood, near the threshold separating life from whatever came next. The realization felt profound. The frightened boy and the aging man seemed connected by a single question. What happens when the journey ends? Soon that question would no longer be theoretical. Soon it would become personal, very personal. As the lamp slowly burned lower, Menna closed his eyes, not sleeping, simply reflecting. And somewhere within those reflections, another understanding quietly emerged. Throughout his life, he had searched for the greatest Egyptian fear. He had considered judgment, chaos, forgetting, failure, oblivion, yet perhaps all of them pointed toward the same thing: the fear of ceasing to matter, the fear that one's existence might leave no lasting mark, the fear that life itself might prove insignificant. It was a powerful fear, perhaps the most powerful of all. Yet Menna was beginning to suspect that the answer might be more complicated, because the closer he came to the end, the more he realized something surprising. Fear was only half the story. The other half was hope. And soon, as his final days approached, hope and fear would meet together in a moment that would determine everything. The season changed once more. Cooler winds began arriving during the evenings. The harsh heat that had dominated much of the year gradually softened. Across the fields surrounding the village, workers continued their daily routines. Boats still moved along the Nile. Merchants still negotiated prices. Children still laughed while chasing one another through dusty pathways. To an outside observer, nothing appeared unusual. Life continued, as it always had, as it always would. Yet for Menna, each day now carried a different weight. Not a burden, a significance, the awareness that every sunrise might be among the last he would witness. Strangely, this realization made ordinary moments seem extraordinary. The sound of birds greeting dawn, the smell of freshly baked bread, the sight of sunlight reflecting across river water, things he had experienced thousands of times, suddenly felt precious. Not because they had changed, because he had, many years earlier, when Menna was young, he imagined that wisdom arrived suddenly, a dramatic revelation, a moment of perfect understanding. Old age taught him otherwise. Wisdom arrived gradually, quietly, often disguised as ordinary experience. One afternoon, he sat beneath a shaded shelter near the edge of the village. Several grandchildren gathered around him. The youngest wanted stories. They always wanted stories. The older children pretended they were too mature for such things. Yet they listened just as carefully. Menna smiled. Some traditions never changed. He began speaking about his childhood, about the Nile floods, about village festivals, about hunting birds among the reeds. The children listened with fascination. To them, these events seemed impossibly distant, almost mythical. As the stories continued, one granddaughter interrupted. Grandfather, were people afraid back then? The question caused laughter among the others. Children often imagine the past as a completely different world. Menna considered his answer. Then he nodded. Very much. What were they afraid of? The children expected monsters. Perhaps crocodiles. Perhaps invading armies. Instead, Menna answered honestly. They feared many of the same things people fear today. The grandchildren looked confused. Loss, failure, disease, death, loneliness, being forgotten. The list sounded surprisingly familiar. Human beings changed less than they imagined. The details differed. The emotions remained. That evening, after everyone returned home, Menna continued thinking about the conversation. ancient Egyptians possessed unique beliefs, unique customs, unique rituals, yet underneath those differences existed something universal: the desire to matter, the desire to belong, the desire to continue. Perhaps these desires explained everything: the pyramids, the tombs, the inscriptions, the prayers, all represented humanity's attempt to push back against impermanence, an attempt to say, I was here, I lived, my life meant something. The following week brought a visit from a traveling scribe. The man carried messages between settlements and occasionally shared news from larger cities. During dinner at Menna's home, conversation eventually turned toward religion. The scribe mentioned debates occurring among temple scholars, questions that had occupied thinkers for generations, questions without simple answers. One topic especially interested Menna. Some scholars argued that too many people focused on fear. Others argued that fear remained necessary. Without fear, people might neglect their responsibilities. Without fear, moral behavior could weaken. The debate sounded familiar. Humans seemed destined to discuss the same questions repeatedly. After listening for some time, Menna offered a quiet observation. Fear can point the way, but it cannot walk the path for you. The table fell silent. The scribe smiled. That sounds like something a priest would say. Menna laughed softly. No, just an old farmer. Yet later that night, he reflected upon his own words. They felt true. Fear had guided much of his life, but fear alone had never made him a better man. His choices had, his relationships had, his efforts had. Fear might open a door. Character determined whether someone walked through it. Days passed, then weeks. The village entered another cycle of planting and harvest. Meanwhile, Menna's strength continued diminishing. The changes were subtle but constant. He slept more frequently, moved more slowly, spoke less, listened more. Family members worried, though they tried not to show it. Everyone understood what was happening. The body was reaching its limits. One evening, Menna's eldest son sat beside him after the rest of the household had gone to sleep. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Eventually, the son broke it. You taught me how to farm. Menna nodded. You taught me how to provide for a family. Another nod. The son stared into the darkness. You taught me how to endure difficult years. Emotion entered his voice. And I never thanked you properly. Menna looked at him. The boy he remembered was gone. In his place sat a man with gray hair, beginning to appear at his temples. Time had transformed them both. There is nothing to thank me for, Menna replied. The son shook his head. There is. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Menna placed a hand on his son's shoulder. The gesture required no explanation. Some feelings existed beyond language. Later, after everyone had retired for the night, Menna remained awake. His thoughts drifted toward the past. Thousands of memories waited there, some bright, some painful, some incomplete, a lifetime compressed into fragments. And among those fragments, a realization slowly emerged. No life ever felt finished. There was always another conversation one wished to have, another journey one wished to take, another day one wished to experience. Perhaps that explained why people struggled with mortality, not because life lacked meaning, because it possessed so much meaning. Leaving something valuable behind was difficult. The next morning, Menna requested assistance reaching the river. The walk proved tiring, yet he insisted. Eventually, his family helped him reach a familiar spot overlooking the Nile. There he sat quietly for hours, watching the water flow northward. The river had witnessed everything. Generations came and went. The Nile remained. Children became adults. Adults became ancestors. The Nile remained. Kingdoms rose. Kingdoms declined. The Nile remained. Its constancy comforted him. In many ways, it represented continuity itself. As sunlight danced across the water, Menna remembered something Painhissy once said long ago. Knowledge can increase fear. At the time, he had not fully understood. Now he did. The more a person learned about life, the more aware they became of its fragility. The more aware they became of loss. The more aware they became of uncertainty. Yet knowledge also increased appreciation. One could not have one without the other. To love deeply was to risk grief. To understand life was to understand mortality. The two were inseparable. Several days later, Menna experienced a vivid dream. Or perhaps it was something between a dream and a memory. In it, he walked through fields, illuminated by golden sunlight. People from different periods of his life appeared. His parents, his friends, his brother, faces long absent from the world of the living. Nobody spoke. Words seemed unnecessary. Instead, they simply walked together. The feeling accompanying the dream remained with him after waking. Peace, not certainty, not answers. Peace. When he described the experience to a priest, the man listened thoughtfully. Then he smiled. Sometimes the heart speaks in ways the mind cannot. Menna found the response satisfying, not because it explained the dream, because it didn't try to. Some mysteries deserved respect. As autumn deepened, visitors arrived more frequently. Friends wished to see him. Relatives traveled from neighboring settlements. Conversations stretched late into the evening. Stories were shared. Memories exchanged. Laughter mixed with tears. The atmosphere often felt less like mourning and more like celebration. A celebration of a life still being lived. One particular visit remained unforgettable. An elderly woman arrived whom Menna had not seen in decades. As children, they had played together beside the river. Their lives eventually followed different paths, yet the years vanished almost instantly Once conversation began, they laughed about old adventures, old mistakes, old embarrassments. The visit reminded Menna how much history existed within a single human life, entire worlds hidden inside memory, entire chapters invisible to outsiders. When the woman finally departed, she offered a simple farewell. "You lived well." The words affected him more than he expected, not because they praised him, because they reflected something he had been searching for, a measure of success beyond wealth, beyond status, beyond monuments. Perhaps a life well lived represented its own achievement. Perhaps that was enough. As another month passed, Menna's strength weakened further. Even short walks became difficult. Most days were now spent close to home, yet his mind remained active, reflective, curious. He continued thinking about the same question that had followed him for decades. What did ancient Egyptians fear most? The answer seemed clearer now than ever before. Not death itself. Death was inevitable. Not even judgment. Judgment represented consequence. The deepest fear lay elsewhere, in meaninglessness, in being forgotten, in believing one's existence had mattered for nothing. That fear connected all the others. And yet, as Menna looked around at his family, his friends, and the generations that would continue after him, he began suspecting something remarkable. Maybe the fear was not entirely justified. Maybe human beings left traces behind them in countless unseen ways, ways larger than tombs, ways larger than names carved in stone, ways capable of surviving long after memory faded. Soon, very soon, Menna would confront the final mystery directly. And there, standing at the edge of everything he had ever known, he would discover whether the fears that shaped ancient Egypt had been warnings, or something far more profound. As the months continued slipping quietly into the past, Menna found himself living in a strange space between two worlds. One world remained firmly rooted in everyday life. The laughter of grandchildren, the smell of bread baking in clay ovens, the distant calls of farmers working the fields, the endless movement of the Nile, the familiar sounds and sights that had accompanied him since childhood. The other world existed somewhere beyond sight, a place of questions, a place of mystery, a place he had spent his entire life preparing to enter. With each passing week, that unseen world seemed a little closer. His family noticed it too, not because Menna spoke about death constantly. In fact, he rarely did. The change revealed itself in quieter ways. He spent longer periods simply observing, watching sunlight move across walls, watching birds circle above the river, watching children play. There was a tenderness in his attention now, an appreciation that only appeared when someone understood how valuable ordinary moments truly were. One afternoon, while sitting beneath the shade of a sycamore tree near his home, Menna watched several children building small structures from mud. The scene reminded him instantly of his own childhood. For a brief moment, the decades separating past and present seemed to disappear. He could almost see himself among them, a barefoot boy running beside the Nile, curious about everything, afraid of very little, unaware of how quickly life would pass. The memory made him smile. Then something unexpected happened. One of the youngest children looked up and asked him a question. "Grandfather Menna, when you were my age, did you know you would become old?" The adults nearby laughed. The child seemed confused by their reaction. Menna chuckled softly. "No." The child frowned. "Why not?" "Because when you are young, old age feels like a story that happens to other people." The answer produced more laughter. Yet it was true. Youth possessed a peculiar blindness. The future felt endless. Time felt abundant. Only later did people realize how quickly years could vanish. That evening, after the children returned home, Menna remained outside, watching the sunset. The western sky glowed with deep shades of orange and gold. In Egyptian belief, sunset held special significance. It symbolized transition, the sun descending toward the underworld, the beginning of its nightly journey through darkness. As a boy, Menna had imagined this journey vividly. Monsters lurking beyond the horizon, divine battles taking place beneath the earth, Ra sailing through dangerous realms, while chaos attempted to destroy creation. The stories had frightened him. Now they fascinated him, because they reflected something deeply human. The belief that darkness never had the final word. The belief that morning followed night, that renewal followed endings, that hope survived uncertainty. Perhaps that was why Egyptians loved these stories so much. Not because they explained everything, because they reassured people that endings were not always permanent. The following week, Menna's health worsened noticeably. Even standing required effort. Family members remained close, almost constantly. His sons handled responsibilities he once managed himself. His grandchildren assisted whenever possible. No one complained. No one hesitated. This was what families did. They carried one another, especially during difficult seasons. One evening, as lamps flickered softly throughout the house, Menna found himself surrounded by relatives. The atmosphere felt peaceful. Conversation drifted naturally from one topic to another. Stories resurfaced. Old memories returned. Laughter echoed through the room. At one point, someone mentioned a village festival from decades earlier. Immediately, several family members began debating details. Who attended? What happened? Which year it occurred? The discussion grew increasingly animated. Menna listened quietly. Then he realized something remarkable. Each person remembered the event differently. Different details, different emotions, different perspectives. The same experience had produced multiple versions of reality. The observation intrigued him. Human memory was imperfect, incomplete, selective, yet despite those limitations, memory remained powerful, powerful enough to preserve moments for decades, powerful enough to keep the dead present among the living, powerful enough to shape entire civilizations. Perhaps that was why Egyptians valued remembrance so deeply, not because memory was flawless, because it was precious. As the gathering continued, Menna noticed his youngest granddaughter sitting nearby. She had been unusually quiet all evening. Eventually, she approached him. "Are you afraid?" The room fell silent. Children often asked questions adults avoided. Nobody interrupted. Everyone waited. Menna looked at the girl, then toward the faces surrounding him. People he loved. People who loved him. The answer deserved honesty. Sometimes the child nodded, apparently satisfied by the response. Yet Menna continued speaking. Being brave does not mean never feeling afraid. She tilted her head curiously. What does it mean then? It means moving forward, even when fear exists. The room remained quiet. Several adults exchanged thoughtful glances, because the answer applied to far more than death. It applied to life, to responsibility, to hardship, to uncertainty, to everything. Later that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Menna remained awake. Moonlight entered through a small opening in the wall. The silver light illuminated familiar objects throughout the room, items accumulated across a lifetime, tools, decorations, personal belongings, simple things, yet each carried memories. Each represented part of a larger story. His story. For years, he had worried about what happened after death. Now another realization emerged. The story itself mattered, not merely the ending, the entire journey, every decision, every relationship, every lesson learned, every challenge overcome. The value of life could not be measured only by its conclusion. It existed throughout the experience itself. The thought brought unexpected peace. Several days later, a priest visited once again. The two men spoke privately for much of the afternoon. Eventually, their conversation turned toward ancient religious texts. The priest mentioned a teaching found in certain temple traditions. According to the teaching, people often misunderstood the purpose of judgment. Many imagined it as a test, a trial, a moment designed to trap the soul. The teaching suggested something different. Judgment revealed truth. Nothing more, nothing less. The scales did not create reality. They measured it. The distinction fascinated Menna. If true, it changed everything. The goal was not to deceive the scales. The goal was to live honestly enough that deception became unnecessary. The priest eventually departed, yet the idea remained. And as Menna reflected upon his life, he found comfort in it. He had made mistakes, many mistakes. He had experienced moments of selfishness, moments of weakness, moments of regret. he had also loved, worked, provided, learned, endured. Perhaps a human life was never meant to be perfect. Perhaps it was meant to be sincere. The following days became increasingly difficult physically. Even short conversations left him tired. Rest occupied much of his time. Yet mentally, he remained alert, observant, present. One afternoon, he requested to be taken outside. Several family members helped him reach a shaded area overlooking the Nile. There he sat quietly, watching the river, watching the world continue. The sight affected him profoundly. Nothing stopped. Nothing paused. The river flowed. Birds hunted. Children laughed. Life moved forward. At first glance, the realization might have seemed sad. It wasn't. In many ways, it felt reassuring. The world did not depend upon any single person, not even a pharaoh, not even a great priest. The continuity of life represented something beautiful. Generations inherited the future from those who came before, then passed it onward. Menna had participated in that chain. Soon others would continue it. As sunset approached, golden light spread across the landscape. The scene looked almost unreal. The river shimmered. The fields glowed. The distant desert appeared timeless. For a brief moment, everything seemed connected. Life and death, past and future, memory and forgetting, fear and hope, all part of the same larger story. And in that moment, Menna finally understood something that had taken nearly an entire lifetime to learn. Ancient Egyptians feared many things: judgment, chaos, oblivion, the loss of their names, the destruction of their tombs, the failure of their hearts. Yet beneath every one of those fears lay a single desire: to continue, to matter, to remain connected to existence. Fear grew from love. People feared losing what they valued. They feared losing life because life was precious. The realization felt almost obvious now, yet it had taken decades to reach. As darkness settled across the Nile Valley, Menna sensed that the final mystery was approaching, closer than ever before. Soon questions would become answers. Soon belief would become experience. Soon the journey every Egyptian prepared for would finally begin. And when it did, Menna would discover whether the hopes that sustained his civilization were stronger than the fears that haunted it. The days grew quieter, not because the world around Menna had changed. The Nile still flowed steadily toward the sea. Farmers still rose before sunrise. Children still filled the village with noise and energy. The world continued exactly as it always had, but Menna now experienced it from a different distance. His body had become fragile. Movement required assistance. Most tasks once performed effortlessly now belonged to others. The change might have frustrated a younger man. For Menna, it simply felt like another stage of the journey. He had watched enough seasons pass to understand that resistance could not stop time. Only acceptance could bring peace. One morning, he awoke before dawn. The village remained asleep. A cool breeze drifted through the doorway. For several minutes, he listened to the silence. Then he heard something familiar. Birds, the first birds greeting the approaching sunrise. The sound instantly transported him backward through decades. He remembered hearing the same calls as a child. The same sounds had accompanied him throughout life. Thousands upon thousands of mornings. Now, hearing them again, he felt a strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. Not sadness because the end approached. Sadness because life had been beautiful. Leaving beautiful things behind was never easy. As daylight slowly spread across the horizon, Menna found himself reflecting upon a realization that had grown stronger over recent months. For years, he had believed the greatest Egyptian fear involved death. Then he believed it involved judgment. Later, he suspected it was oblivion, being forgotten, having one's name erased. Now he understood something deeper. Those fears were not separate. They were branches growing from the same root. The fear of losing connection, connection to family, connection to memory, connection to meaning, connection to existence itself. That was what Egyptians fought against. Not merely physical death, separation. The thought remained with him throughout the day. Later that afternoon, several grandchildren visited. As usual, they requested stories. Menna smiled. Even now, they wanted stories. Perhaps especially now. He told them about the Nile floods of his youth, about enormous crocodiles glimpsed near the riverbanks, about festivals that lasted deep into the night, about mistakes he made as a young man. The children listened eagerly. At one point, a grandson asked whether he would like to live forever if given the opportunity. The question surprised everyone. Menna laughed softly. Then he considered it seriously. Forever, the word carried tremendous weight. Ancient Egyptians certainly desired eternal life. Their entire civilization reflected that desire. Temples, tombs, prayers, mummification, everything pointed toward continuity. Yet, after thinking carefully, Menna gave an unexpected answer. I would want enough time to appreciate life fully. The grandson frowned. That isn't the same thing. No, Menna agreed. It isn't. The child waited. Eventually, Menna continued. A person who never loses anything may never truly value anything. The room fell quiet. The adults understood. The children mostly didn't. But one day they would. Loss gave meaning to preservation. Mortality gave meaning to life. Without endings, beginnings would matter less. Without limits, time would feel less precious. It was a difficult lesson, one most people learned gradually. The following evening, a priest arrived carrying several sacred texts. He intended to spend time reading prayers with Menna. The visit proved comforting. not because the texts eliminated uncertainty, because they connected Menna to generations stretching far into the past. The same words had been spoken by countless Egyptians before him: farmers, priests, officials, mothers, fathers, people facing the same mystery, the same hopes, the same fears. At one point, the priest paused and looked toward Menna. "Do you still fear judgment?" The question hung in the air. Months earlier, the answer would have been immediate. Now it required thought. Finally, Menna nodded. "A little." The priest smiled. "Only a little." Menna returned the smile. A lifetime gives a person many opportunities to make peace with himself. The answer seemed to satisfy them both. After the priest departed, Menna spent much of the night awake, not from discomfort, from reflection. The moon illuminated the room softly. Memories drifted through his thoughts, thousands of them, some clear, some fragmented, some joyful, some painful. He remembered his first glimpse of a funeral procession as a child, the fear he felt hearing about the devourer, the anxiety that accompanied thoughts of judgment, the years spent wondering whether he had done enough, whether he had prepared adequately, whether his heart would prove worthy. And now, standing near the end of life, those fears appeared different, smaller somehow, not because they lacked importance, because experience had changed their shape. The devourer no longer represented a monster waiting in darkness. It represented failure to live honestly. Judgment no longer represented punishment. It represented truth. The afterlife no longer represented escape. It represented continuation. The symbols remained. Their meaning deepened. Several days later, Menna asked to see the river once more. His family gladly agreed. The journey required considerable effort, yet no one complained. They understood. Some places become part of a person's soul. The Nile had always been such a place for Menna. Supported by relatives, he reached a familiar location overlooking the water. There he sat for hours, watching, listening, remembering. The river moved steadily northward, unconcerned with human affairs, unconcerned with lifetimes, yet somehow connected to all of them. As sunlight reflected across the water, Menna thought about the generations that had stood in this exact place. People whose names were forgotten. People whose names survived. People who feared judgment. People who feared oblivion. People who hoped for eternity. The same hopes, the same fears, repeated endlessly across centuries. Suddenly, he understood something extraordinary. The desire to continue did not begin with him, and it would not end with him. Every generation inherited it. Every generation expressed it differently, but it remained a fundamental part of being human. The realization filled him with unexpected peace. He was part of something larger, much larger. That evening, after returning home, he gathered several family members around him. The conversation lasted late into the night. Stories were shared. Advice was given. Laughter appeared frequently. So did tears. Nobody attempted to hide emotions anymore. There seemed little reason. At one point, his eldest grandson asked a final question. The same grandson who had spent years listening to his stories. The same grandson who now stood on the threshold of becoming an elder himself. What do you think ancient Egyptians feared most? The room grew quiet. The question carried special significance. It had followed Menna throughout his entire life. For a long moment, he considered his answer. Then he spoke slowly. They feared that their lives would disappear. Everyone listened carefully. Menna continued. They feared being forgotten. They feared losing their place in the world. They feared standing before truth and discovering they had not lived as they should. He paused. The firelight flickered softly across the room. But those fears existed because they loved life. No one interrupted. They loved family. They loved memory. They loved existence itself. Fear grew from love. The words settled over the gathering. Simple, yet profound. For decades, Menna had searched for the deepest Egyptian fear. Now he believed he finally understood. The fear was not death. Death happened to everyone. The fear was non-existence. The possibility that everything one loved, everything one valued, everything one was, might simply vanish. That was the nightmare hidden beneath every tomb, every prayer, every ritual, every monument, the fear that nothing remained. Yet as Menna looked around the room, another realization emerged. Something remained. Always. Not perfectly. Not forever. But something. Influence remained. Love remained. Memory remained. Stories remained. The traces people left within one another remained. Perhaps that was why civilizations built monuments, not merely to preserve stone, to preserve connection. As the gathering finally ended and family members drifted toward sleep, Menna remained awake beside the fatting fire. Outside, stars filled the sky above Egypt, the same stars that had watched over pharaohs, the same stars that had watched over farmers, the same stars that had watched over countless generations, now gone. For a long time, he stared upward, and for the first time since childhood, he felt neither fear nor uncertainty dominating his thoughts, only curiosity. The mystery remained. The answers still waited beyond the horizon, but the fear that once accompanied them had softened, transformed. Soon the final journey would begin. Soon Menna would step beyond stories and beliefs into whatever reality awaited. And there, at the boundary between life and eternity, the final truth of ancient Egypt's greatest fear would reveal itself at last. The final chapter began without ceremony. No messenger arrived. No prophecy appeared. No sign emerged from the heavens. Life simply continued, becoming quieter, smaller, more focused. The vast world that had once stretched endlessly before Menna gradually narrowed to a handful of precious things: family, memory, the river, the sky, the people gathered around him. Everything else seemed less important now. One morning, shortly before sunrise, Menna opened his eyes and immediately sensed something different. Not alarming, not painful, different. The feeling was difficult to describe, almost as if he had reached the end of a very long road and could finally see the destination in the distance. The awareness settled over him gently. He did not mention it to anyone. There seemed no need. Some truths arrived without requiring words. Outside, the village slowly awakened. Doors opened. Voices emerged. Animals stirred. Another ordinary day began. Yet Menna found himself studying everything with unusual attention. The texture of mud brick walls, the scent of cooking fires, the sound of sandals moving across packed earth. Things he had encountered tens of thousands of times. Things so familiar they usually passed unnoticed. Now each detail felt important, almost sacred. Throughout the day, visitors arrived. Friends, neighbors, relatives. Many simply sat with him. Conversation came and went naturally. Sometimes people spoke. Sometimes they remained silent. Both seemed appropriate. One elderly neighbor recalled events from decades earlier. A flood that nearly destroyed several farms. A harvest celebration remembered for years afterward. The story triggered laughter throughout the room. Soon, everyone contributed memories. One recollection led to another. Entire sections of the past returned to life. Menna listened more than he spoke. The experience reminded him of something he had gradually learned. A human life does not exist in isolation. Every memory connects to other people. Every story includes other voices. Every life overlaps with countless others. The realization felt comforting. He had never truly walked alone. That evening, his family shared a meal together. The atmosphere felt warm, peaceful, yet beneath the conversations existed an unspoken awareness. Time had become precious. Nobody wasted it. No arguments emerged. No complaints mattered. Only presence, only connection, only gratitude. After the meal ended, Menna asked his eldest grandson to accompany him outside. The young man agreed immediately. Together, they sat beneath the darkening sky. The stars gradually appeared overhead. Thousands of them, silent, ancient, unchanging. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Menna finally broke the silence. When I was your age, I thought wisdom meant having answers. The grandson smiled. And now, Menna looked upward. Now I think wisdom means learning which questions matter. The younger man considered this carefully. What questions matter most? Menna did not answer immediately. The night breeze moved softly through the village. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The Nile flowed unseen beyond the darkness. Finally, he replied, "Did I love well?" The grandson remained silent. "Did I live honestly?" Another pause. "Did I help more than I harmed?" The old man smiled faintly. "Everything else seems less important." The conversation remained with the grandson long after it ended. It remained with Menna as well, because for the first time, the questions felt complete, no longer scattered, no longer confusing. Simple, essential, human. The following days passed gently. Menna slept more frequently. His strength continued fading. Walking became nearly impossible. Most hours were spent resting, yet his mind remained remarkably clear. Family members often found him quietly observing the world around him, watching sunlight move across the floor, watching children through open doorways, watching life continue. One afternoon, his youngest granddaughter climbed beside him. She had always been curious, always willing to ask questions others avoided. For several minutes, she sat quietly. Then she asked something unexpected. "Grandfather, do you think people disappear?" The room became very still. Adults exchanged glances. Nobody interrupted. Menna looked at the child carefully. The question deserved thought. Finally, he answered, "Some things disappear." The girl waited, but not everything. "What stays?" Menna smiled. "Love stays." The child nodded thoughtfully. "Stories stay." Another nod. "The good things we give to others stay." The girl seemed satisfied. Children often understood profound truths more easily than adults, perhaps because they did not overcomplicate them. That evening, Menna reflected upon the conversation. For most of his life, he had searched for permanence. Like every Egyptian, like countless generations before him, he had imagined permanence as something physical, a tomb, an inscription, a preserved name. Now he saw it differently. Physical things mattered, but influence mattered too. Kindness mattered. Teaching mattered. Relationships mattered. These things continued moving through time long after individual lives ended. Perhaps that was another form of eternity, not the eternity promised by priests. A different kind, a human kind. Days passed, then another week. The boundary between waking and dreaming seemed to blur occasionally. Memories arrived unexpectedly. Sometimes Menna felt as though entire decades existed simultaneously. His childhood remained vivid. His youth remained vivid. His old age remained vivid. Past and present intertwined. The experience felt strangely peaceful, not confusing, comforting, as though his life was gathering itself together. One evening, while resting quietly, he found himself thinking about Hari once again, the old neighbor whose death had frightened him as a child. So many years had passed, nearly an entire lifetime. Yet he could still remember the funeral, the whispers about judgment, the terrifying descriptions of the devourer, the fear that had entered his young heart. At the time, everything seemed so frightening. Now, looking back, he understood something important. The adults at that funeral had not been trying to frighten children. They had been trying to explain mystery, trying to give shape to uncertainty, trying to create meaning. That realization transformed many memories. Ancient Egyptian beliefs suddenly appeared less concerned with fear than he once assumed. Yes, fear existed, but beneath it existed hope. The hope that life mattered, the hope that justice existed, the hope that goodness possessed value, the hope that death was not the end. Without those hopes, the fears would have been unbearable. The following morning, a priest arrived for what both men quietly understood might be their final conversation. The priest sat beside Menna for several hours. They discussed many things: family, faith, memory, time. Eventually, the priest asked a question. "What do you think now?" Menna smiled faintly. The question required no explanation. They both knew what it meant. What did he think about death? About judgment? About eternity? About everything? For several moments, he remained silent. Then he answered, "I think fear teaches us what we value." The priest nodded slowly. Menna continued, "We fear losing the things we love." A pause. "We fear losing life because life is precious." Another pause. "We fear being forgotten because connection matters." The priest listened carefully. "And judgment." Menna looked toward the doorway, where sunlight illuminated part of the floor. "I think judgment frightened people because they wanted their lives to mean something." The priest smiled. Neither man spoke for a while. No additional explanation seemed necessary. Later that day, after the priest departed, Menna drifted into sleep. Dreams came easily now, some strange, some familiar. In one dream, he walked beside the Nile as a young boy. The river sparkled beneath brilliant sunlight. His parents stood nearby. Friends laughed in the distance. Everything appeared exactly as it once had. Yet he understood something within the dream. He was not reliving the past. He was remembering it, and memory itself felt beautiful. When he awoke, evening shadows filled the room. Family members sat nearby, watching, waiting, loving. The sight filled him with profound gratitude, not because his life had been perfect, because it had been full of work, full of relationships, full of lessons, full of moments worth remembering. Outside, darkness settled across Egypt, the same darkness that had arrived every night for thousands of years, the same darkness that Egyptians imagined Ra crossing on his journey through the underworld. Soon another dawn would come. Whether Menna would see it remained uncertain. But as he closed his eyes and listened to the familiar sounds of his family nearby, one thing had become clear. The fear that once dominated his thoughts no longer held the same power, because because after a lifetime spent searching for the answer, he had finally discovered something greater than fear. Meaning. The night passed quietly. No storms gathered above the Nile. No omens appeared among the stars. No supernatural signs announced what was coming. Egypt slept beneath a sky that looked exactly as it had on countless nights before. Yet inside Menna's home, something was changing. The final pages of a very long story were turning. As dawn approached, Menna opened his eyes. The room remained dim. The first light of morning had not yet entered through the doorway. For a few moments, he simply listened. Breathing, silence, the faint sounds of family members sleeping nearby. He had spent an entire lifetime hearing such sounds. A lifetime surrounded by people, parents, friends, a wife, children, grandchildren, neighbors, teachers, strangers who became companions, companions who became memories. Now all those years seemed strangely close, not distant, not lost, close, as though every chapter of his life had gathered together around him. The sensation felt peaceful, more peaceful than he would have believed possible when he was young. The frightened boy who once heard stories about judgment and monsters could never have imagined this feeling. That boy had feared darkness, feared the unknown, feared what waited beyond death. The old man lying here still respected those mysteries, but fear no longer stood at the center of them. Understanding had taken its place. As sunrise slowly approached, family members began waking. One by one, they gathered nearby. No dramatic conversations occurred. No grand speeches. Just presence. The simple gift of being together. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes it is everything. The first rays of sunlight eventually entered the room. Golden light spread across the walls. The same sunlight Menna had watched since childhood. The same sunlight that had warmed the fields, illuminated temples, reflected across the Nile, marked the passing of countless days. He watched it carefully, appreciatively, like an old friend. Several grandchildren sat nearby. Some attempted to hide tears. Others made little effort. Emotion felt natural now. No one needed to pretend. The truth was visible to everyone. Time had nearly completed its work. Yet, despite the sadness in the room, another feeling existed alongside it. Gratitude, because Menna had lived long enough to see generations continue after him, long enough to pass knowledge forward, long enough to become part of stories others would someday tell. Not everyone received such a gift. The morning passed slowly. Visitors arrived throughout the day. Neighbors stopped by. Friends offered farewells. Old companions shared final memories. The atmosphere felt less like an ending and more like a gathering of lives connected across decades. At one point, Menna's eldest grandson leaned close. The young man had become strong, wise, capable, a man now not the child who once sat beside the river, asking endless questions. "Grandfather," he said softly, "is there anything else you want us to remember?" The room grew quiet. Everyone listened. Menna thought for a long moment. His voice had grown weak, yet the words emerged clearly. "Remember each other." The answer surprised some people. Perhaps they expected religious instructions, ancient wisdom, secret knowledge. Instead, they received something simple, something human. Remember each other. Because throughout his life, Menna had gradually learned that memory connected generations. Memory defeated disappearance. Memory allowed love to travel through time. The afternoon sun climbed higher. Hours passed. The house became quieter. People spoke softly. Some prayed. Others reflected. Several children slept nearby. Exhausted by emotions they could not fully understand, Menna rested frequently, yet whenever he opened his eyes, he found familiar faces waiting, watching, caring, remaining present. As evening approached, the western sky began changing color. Orange, gold, deep red, the colors of sunset spread across Egypt. The same sunset Egyptians had watched for thousands of years. The same sunset associated with endings, with transitions, with journeys. Menna looked toward the fading light, and suddenly he remembered something from long ago. A conversation beside the Nile, a question asked by a child. What did ancient Egyptians fear most? For nearly an entire lifetime, he had searched for the answer. Now, standing at the edge of everything he had ever known, the answer seemed clearer than ever. Ancient Egyptians feared being forgotten. They feared losing connection. They feared meaninglessness. They feared the possibility that their lives might vanish without a trace. That fear inspired tombs, inspired monuments, inspired prayers, inspired countless acts of remembrance. Yet now Menna understood something equally important. The fear was never the whole story. Hope had always existed beside it. Hope that memory endured. Hope that goodness mattered. Hope that life possessed purpose. Hope that love survived loss. Without hope, the civilization of Egypt could never have built what it built, could never have dreamed what it dreamed, could never have endured for so long. As darkness slowly settled across the landscape, Menna felt neither terror nor despair, only curiosity. The mystery remained. The answers still waited beyond the horizon, but he no longer needed certainty. A lifetime had taught him something valuable. Not every question required an answer before the journey continued. Sometimes trust was enough. Sometimes meaning was enough. Sometimes a life honestly lived was enough. Family members remained beside him as night deepened. Outside, stars appeared above the Nile Valley. Ancient stars, silent stars, witnesses to countless human stories. Menna gazed upward through the doorway, and for a moment, he imagined all the generations who had looked at those same lights before him. The forgotten, the remembered, the wealthy, the poor, the famous, the ordinary, all united by the same experience, all sharing the same journey, all searching for meaning. The thought brought comfort because he realized something profound. No one truly walks alone. Every life becomes part of something larger, something that continues long after individual footsteps fade, long after individual voices fall silent. The house grew very quiet. Breathing slowed. The night deepened. Family members held hands. Some prayed softly. Others simply sat nearby. And there, surrounded by the people he loved, beneath the stars that had watched over Egypt for millennia, Menna felt the final fear loosen its grip, not because he had solved every mystery, because he had discovered what mattered more than mystery: connection, meaning, love, the things that fear had been protecting all along. And as the night carried him gently toward the final horizon, the story of one ordinary Egyptian reached its closing chapter. But the stories he created, the lessons he shared, the lives he touched, those continued, flowing forward like the Nile itself, beyond sight, beyond memory, beyond time. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.